My name is Lisa Arkin. I am the executive director of the nonprofit organization Beyond Toxics. We are a statewide organization working with all sorts of communities on environmental health issues. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight and to just introduce some other important people and kind of get the party started.
I guess the one message that I want to make sure that we get across to you guys tonight is that we are here to learn. I am not a subject matter expert on forestry or timber practices, but I do live here in Curry County, and I saw my fellow citizens have an experience that was not real pleasant, and I thought, gosh, maybe we can come together as a community and start a discussion and have a conversation around this practice and perhaps have some influence on how things happen in our community and the health of our community. And so as a graduate of the Ford Leadership Development Program, I thought, you know what? We have these skills. We've learned these skills. Let's bring our town together, our community together, and let's have a conversation. So that's what we're here for. We're here to learn, and we're here to talk amongst ourselves about how, what's happening in our community and what we would like to see happening in our community. And I'm going to turn it over to our capable moderator and facilitator, Olivia, and thank her for bringing her skills to this evening.
Good evening, and again, welcome. Okay, our first speakers, overview of the Oregon Forest Practices Act. That is Link Smith.
So you've got a contingent of folks that if you see us wandering around the snack table, please don't hesitate to ask any of us a question if you have any. I was asked here, I appreciate the invitation, by the way, but I was asked to come here tonight to give you kind of a brief overview of the Department of Forestry's Forest Practices Act, Oregon Forest Practices Act, and specifically speak a little bit more to the chemical side or the chemical application of herbicides and how we apply those rules in our agency. So the next thing I'm going to say, just to put a quick plug in, Oregon happened to have the very first Forest Practices Act in the nation. That was enacted in 1971. And that's been a continuing changes have evolved, as new science becomes available to us. There's been a series of changes to that act, so it's kind of a ever-changing set of rules, basically, as we find new information. So it's pretty neat that it's as old and established as it is. And again, I'm kind of sorry if I'm also visually challenged here. I brought the wrong glasses, so I can't see the computer unless I get up here really awkwardly close. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is our notification process. Any operation that has to do with the growing and harvesting of trees in Oregon has to go through a notification. So that means if they are going to go build road into a unit, or if they're cutting the trees down, or if they're burning the slash, or if they're spraying herbicides on the unit to control vegetation, there's a notification process, and they have to turn in that intent or an intent to perform that operation. That's Lisa's phone, just in case anybody wanted to know. She's taking the heat off me. I appreciate that. And really what that is, you see there, it's a communication tool for us. And so really what we're charged with by the legislature, we have two charges, and that is to ensure that trees are growing again after they have been removed. So if you've harvested trees, we make sure that people replant and establish a new forest. And the other is to protect our natural resources. And so this is a notification here as a communication tool with us. So if you're going to go harvest timber, you come to us and tell us what your intent to do is on your property. And our job is to tell you what resources are out there, whether it be fish or spotted owls or eagles or murrelets or you name it. Our job is to help communicate with you what those resources are and what you have to do to ensure protection of those resources. And this is the tool that you use. Part of that tool can include a written plan. Written plans are more specific information that we request from you. So for instance, if you have what we call a fish stream on your property, we're going to ask if you're going to cut trees so close to it, we're going to make you turn in additional information to communicate how you're going to protect that resource. That'll include the buffer distance or specifically what kind of machinery you're going to use to do that. Something else that I thought a lot of folks might be interested in, being from Western Lane, we have in Lane County a great deal of interest in the harvesting operations, or just what I call timber management operations there. And so we have a subscription service. What that is, it's $25 minimum fee, and you can sign up for as many as 5 sections on that. A section is a square mile of land. And with that, when somebody turns in a notification, we will, I guess that's the word I'm looking for there, we will turn that information around and send it to you so you know what's going on in that section of land that you signed up for. We have, just to boast a little bit, I don't know if it's boasting, but we have more subscribers in my district in Western Lane, I believe, than any other district put together, all the other districts put together. So it's just a lot of interest there. You'll see it's fee-based there. There's been a lot of consternation over the fact that why would we charge for that information? And what I'd want to tell you is, again, think about historically, 10 years ago even, when somebody turns in a notification, it's all on paper. Then we input it into a computer program, but for us to get that information to you, we've got to turn around and put it in an envelope and mail it to you. And that takes a lot of administration time and costs. And so that's why that fee was established. Currently, when I say that there's a lot of changes going on in the Forest Practices Act, we're going through a new program that's called FERNS, the Forest, help me out here, Forest Electronic Reporting and Notification System. And that's being built right as we speak right now, and it's actually in a trial phase, basically stepping up to the plate and becoming more electronic like the rest of the world here. And so I wouldn't be surprised in very soon coming years that subscription or that kind of information, if you want to know what's going on near your home, that information will be available online to you, and my guess is it'll be at a reduced price from that as well. Regarding the chemical rules, chemicals referred to as pesticides. Typically, most of the pesticides that we use in forestry are actually herbicides. Personally, in the 12 or 14 years that I've done worked around the stewardship forestry program, there were some rodenticides that were used for the mountain beaver, but 99.9% of any of the pesticides we talk about are actually herbicides. And the purpose there, I'm going to turn around because I can read that one a lot easier. Basically, it's a management tool. The good thing, and what I always tell people about this country here is, we live in some of the best tree growing ground in the world. We truly do. That same ground makes it some of the best brush growing ground in the world as well. And I think if any of you are homeowners or own just a small piece of land in this country, you would understand that. And when I say that we have a charge to ensure that trees are grown or replaced after they've been removed in a harvesting operation, the herbicides that we typically work with or oversee the use of are there to control the brush. And that brush they need to control simply to try to get the trees, get above the brush, get a good foothold before the brush takes them over. One of the misunderstandings, most misunderstood things about the chemical use in forestry is people think that they're out there spraying it every year like you do on your lawn to get rid of weeds. Typically, most forest operations, you'll see 2, maybe 3 applications of chemicals in the first couple of years after the trees, either right before or just after the trees are planted. And again, it's to knock back the brush and the grass to let the tree get established so it doesn't get overgrown, because they won't survive. Most of the dominant tree species in Oregon, the Oregon state tree, the Douglas fir, isn't a shade-tolerant species. So if it gets outshaded by the faster-growing maples and different brushes that are out there, they will end up dying. And so it's just a tool. Again, we don't encourage, we don't force anybody to use chemicals, but that's a tool that's in their chest. And just to talk a little bit more, if you look at the second bullet there, second and third bullet is really what I wanted to state here. You know, a lot of people tell us that the Forest Practices Act doesn't go far enough in its rules. Your rules aren't good enough. Well, we're only one part of the chemical rules in Oregon. We work with many different agencies, and I believe Park has 10 other agencies. Is that right, Mike? I believe it's 10 other agencies that help regulate pesticide use in Oregon, and we're just one part of that. So you'll see and that's part of the reason I brought Mike Odenthal along with Department of Ag. Anything that has to do with label restrictions or label violations, that's a Department of Ag. If it gets in the waters of the state, it could be Department of Environmental Quality. With us, you know, we have spray buffer distances. You'll see nothing in our rules about spraying around a home. That's not the charge that we have. We're charged with natural resources. There's other agencies that deal with that. So I know there's a lot of, again, consternation in saying our act isn't as good as other states. I think overall, state-wise, we're better than other states simply because we specialize. We're more expertise, agency by agency. We work collectively together. And like I said, I know Mike Odenthal's home phone number. I mean, that's how close we work together. If there's something that I see, I call Mike, or I call David Waltz from DEQ, or, you know, we work very collectively there. So that was really the reason I was trying to show that slide there. You'll see in our rules we have special requirements about reporting and cleanup. You'll see, but they're very general rules, again, because we're not the only agency that's working there together. And here's a couple of our most specific rules here. You know, our big goal is to protect the resource, and that's to protect the waters. So no chemical application within specific distances. We have one of the rules is you have to protect all understory vegetation within 10 feet. So I don't care where you spray. If that vegetation ends up dying, you're in violation, and we write tickets for that. So that's kind of how our rules would work. When we talk about labels, we require that people follow the label, but if we think that they sprayed more than they were supposed to on the ground, the agency that would deal with that would be Department of Agriculture. They're more specific to the labels. If we go out there, though, and we see a buffer that's been sprayed, then we write that ticket. Another example of that is we don't allow helicopter spraying within 60 feet of a fish stream. So if we go out there, though, and we see that they've sprayed closer to that, that would be our citation to write. So there's several different agencies that get involved in regulating and enforcing the rules on these chemicals. One of the things that's in our rules is that they must take daily application records. And so when they're out there, they have to, in fact, I have a form. Yeah, I don't know how well you can see that. But there's a lot of different elements there that they have to record the weather, the wind, the temperature, the humidity, what they applied, the date they applied at the time. They have to keep those records for 3 years. And then if we think that there's a violation or we have reason, I'm stepping all over my own cord here, hold on. If we believe that they've had reason to have an issue, we can request those records, but they don't have to turn them into us automatically. That is something that we can request from them, and if we do request it, they have to turn those in. So you'll see that in our rules as well. And again, I told you I was already handicapped by having to stand in one place, so that's got me a little freaked out through this whole presentation here. But feel free to ask any of us questions here in a little while. This slide I've got right here, and again, I apologize, I don't know if you can see that, but this is a picture. I've got a couple pictures here that I'm going to throw up there, and this was a unit that was helicopter sprayed 2 years ago in Western Lane District. And just to give you an example of why landowners are using herbicides as a tool, if you see where that arrow is, there's a little fir tree right there at the tip of that arrow. The leader is right there on the top arrow, and you can see one of the limbs there off to the right. And a whole variety of other vegetation. That fir tree right there is what we call overtopped and would not survive. And so if you're looking at this, if you only own a half an acre, this is something that you could probably go treat manually by yourself. But when you're looking at a 100 acre or a 40 acre or whatever it may be, a clear cut, that's not a manageable means. And so again, they chose herbicide in this sense to use that as a tool. What was? Then they would not be able to do that. They cannot directly apply to waters of the state. Yeah, I apologize if the photo appears. I was just simply trying to show the competing vegetation that they're dealing with here. And when I say that they grow brush as good or better than it grows trees, that's a pretty prime example there. And then just to finish, just to prove that Mike and I, for instance, work together, that's actually Mike right there in that one photo. And then you can see the helicopter applying. You can see the big clumps there are maple clumps, but there's just a helicopter doing some chemical application. It just happens to be a photo that's in our folder that I thought I'd throw into this presentation. But I know there's going to be a lot of, I wish I could have the time and to go specifically through a lot of the Forest Practices Act. The Forest Practices Act is much more than just chemical oversight. And I'm kind of proud of being part of an agency that has a Forest Practices Act like the one that we do. But feel free, when we're done, everybody presenting, I'm not leaving right away. You'll probably find me back there by the homemade salsa.
Okay, are registered water rights and ponds included as resources that are communicated to the operator for protection?
Yes, they are. We also, if you have registered water rights, they do have specific protection for registered water rights. What I will tell you there, out of personal experience, is that there's a lot of people that have domestic water systems in the Coast Range, and a surprising few of those are actually registered. But what I'll also tell you is, in every instance that I can think of in working with neighboring landowners or the landowner that has that water source located on them, they will work with you and protect those as well. They try to be good neighbors as much as they can.
Okay, second question. How often are aerial applications monitored by ODF in order to keep operators honest?
It's like every other operation. Just to give you numbers wise, we've got 4 stewardship foresters in Western Lane, and last year we had around 1,200 notifications of operations. And so some of those, one of the first things we do is we rate them for high, medium, and low priority as to what the need is and what the protected resources are. And to be honest with you, we've had very little problem with aerial application of chemicals as far as violations there. So we do randomly go out. We can't go out on every one of them, but we randomly go out and inspect these several a year. And we also get requests sometimes from the landowners or the operators who are actually applying the chemical for us to come out and just keep an eye on it as well. I would say in our district, we probably about a 10 to 12 a year on average as we go to actually watch the application. And what I will tell you, the interest, what you know about chemicals, if you spray Roundup on your lawn, it dies. If we're out there and looking at subsequent inspections or in the area, one thing about herbicides, you can't miss where you've applied. And it makes it very easy, even if you're not there that day, if you're there 2 weeks later, the dead vegetation is very apparent. And so that's a pretty easy one to keep an eye on, actually.
Thank you. Okay, our last one.
Last question.
If it's not your ticket or violation to write, do you refer to proper agency in a timely manner?
Absolutely. That is absolutely. We have, whether it be memorandums of understanding or memorandums of agreement, but they're memorandums, but the agencies get together. The park board is really the collection of all the agencies together where they get together monthly and visit about the chemical rules and chemical issues. But depending on and I can tell you firsthand that I've called Mike Odenthal when I've seen things or heard of things in our office that weren't right. We've had spills where there happened to be an accident where a vehicle turned over, and there's a system where you call ORs. You can make one phone call, and they, much like Park, if you make that one phone call, they then will find the responsible agency to help out. But I have also, just through our own partnerships, and you get to know somebody in a comfort level to where I've got an awful lot of cell phone numbers on my phone. Most definitely we work very closely with those other agencies. with that, I think I've taken all my time, and just lastly, I'll say, you know, your best knowledge for this area is going to be Stacy.
Okay, for our next speaker. Comparison of Forest Practices Act with other states. Lori Bernstein.
Okay, I'm going to first also talk a little bit about forestry and herbicide use before I go on to comparing the other states. As Lisa showed you, this was a report that I helped co-author for Beyond Toxics. We analyzed herbicide spray records and released this report last December. I encourage you all to look at it online if you don't pick up a copy from Lisa. We analyzed 3 years of industrial forest herbicide spray records in the Triangle Lake area. Triangle Lake in the study area is located 12 to 14 miles west of Eugene. For years, rural communities in the vicinity of Triangle Lake complained from forestry herbicide sprays. In the spring of 2011, 43 of the residents there had their urine tested, and all 43 tested positive for 2,4-D and atrazine, two herbicides commonly used in forestry practices. After these findings of 100% of the urine were tested the samples found atrazine and 2,4-D, Oregon Health Authority took the lead on a public health exposure investigation. In October 2011, Oregon Health Authority requested all the herbicide application records for the area, and they requested them for the years 2009, 10, and 11. And it took 11 months. It wasn't until September of 2012 that they finally did receive all these application records. The spray records became part of the public record, and through a public records request, Beyond Toxics was able to access these spray records. To our knowledge, it was the first time spray records were available to the public and analyzed in Oregon. And these next slides are going to be some of our findings. This slide, I know, is pretty busy and hard to see, but the black outline is the study area that OHA identified. I need more hands. Right there is Triangle Lake, just to give you a little, okay? Yeah, so Oregon Health Authority defined this study area, and what we see here is the clear-cut units that were sprayed in the study area for 2011. The dark red are the aerial spray units, and the orange are the ground spray units. Each unit is labeled with a code, which is probably pretty blurry at this projecting it at this level. Sorry about that. The codes are deciphered from the box in the top left corner. And what we see, you'll have to trust me if you don't see it, is right around here, there's a whole bunch of units that say 2AHFOGR. And what that means, using the box over here, is that each of those units were sprayed with 2,4-D, atrazine, hexazinone, and two adjuvants were also used, foam buster and grounded. So adjuvants help herbicides be more effective, and so it might reduce foam, or it might help the herbicide stick to the vegetation a little bit better. So what we see going on here is a mix of chemicals. It's basically a chemical soup. And when chemicals are mixed together, they can interact with each other, causing much higher toxic, potentially more toxic effects we call synergistic effects. No research addresses how these specific mixes affect humans or the environment, and there's no EPA regulations that consider these synergistic effects. This is a study that found individually chemicals may not be too toxic, but when mixed together, they can have synergistic effects that could be lethal to fish. Now, it's hard to determine trends when only looking at 3 years of data. However, we did find a 99% increase in pounds of pesticide products aerially sprayed between 2009 and 2011. At the same time, aerial spray acres increased 56%. So an increase in acres was only part of the reason for an increase in pounds of pesticide sprayed. Perhaps more chemicals were being mixed together, or rates applied per acre may have increased. We haven't looked and teased up the data to figure that out yet. We also saw that over the 3 years, there was a total of 34,778 total pounds of pesticide products sprayed. That's more than 17 tons in this one study area. We did find units were sprayed multiple times. This slide shows a close-up of Fish Creek, within the Triangle Lake study area. Fish Creek is a designated core cold water habitat stream for salmon and steelhead. The units in yellow were aerially sprayed 1 time. Units in orange were sprayed 2 times, and the red unit was sprayed 3 times. Keep in mind, this is only 3 years of data. So if we had previous and post-spray records, we may see no yellow and more red units. Another thing to point out here, to just explain this map a little further, is this highlighted stream in the middle here. Those are the salmon and steelhead habitat. The purple areas, like here and along there, are areas where spray units were adjacent to salmon and steelhead habitat. The written plans for those spray records did indicate a 60-foot no-cut buffer. The highlighted green streams that we see, those are headwater and tributary streams that often flow directly into the salmon and steelhead habitat. Depending on the time of the year and the size of those tributaries, some may have been flowing during the time of the spray. And since these are non-fish-bearing streams, no buffers were required nor indicated on the written plans. This slide separates out the aerial sprays from spring and fall seasons. We clearly see a difference in the type of chemicals being sprayed during each season. 2,4-D, atrazine, and hexazinone are the most common chemicals sprayed in the spring months, while glyphosate and imazapyr are more common in the fall months. There was a 226% increase in pounds of pesticide products sprayed from the spring 2009 to spring 2011, and this is when 100% of the residents tested positive for atrazine and 2,4-D in their urine samples. We also use an environmental and human health toxicity rating system. This was developed by Cornell University. Ratings above 10 are considered a toxicity concern. And as you can see, as you probably can't see, but trust me, well, you can kind of see, that's 10 there. So all of the ratings were above 10, some more than others. Each column is one spray, and each color within that column represents a different chemical. The height is the toxicity rating for that chemical based on the rate per acre sprayed. We can see the chemicals, some chemicals in tank mixes have a higher toxicity rating than others. This rating does not address the possible synergistic effects. We do see that spring sprays for this data set are more toxic than the fall sprays. Spring is when streams are flowing higher and surface water is running off hillsides. Another thing to note here is that herbicides tend to bind with soil and can move downslope and into fish-bearing streams during this time. So now I'm going to talk more specifically about switching now to starting to compare to other neighboring states' regulations. Spray restrictions are not protecting Oregon water resources. Oregon allows all non-fish-bearing streams to be sprayed, including the ones that flow directly into threatened and endangered listed salmon streams. Washington and Idaho, on the other hand, have no spray buffers that protect all surface waters for aerial and ground sprays. This table compares buffer widths for our neighboring states. We feel Washington is particularly comparable to Oregon with similar habitats and growing conditions. In the 1990s, Washington looked extensively into the research and developed new chemical rules and regulations. As this chart indicates, a typical width of a no-spray buffer for fish-bearing streams in forests similar to Oregon coast would be between 100 and 150 feet. In Washington, it's not cookie cutter. It's not just because it's a fish-bearing stream, it gets a certain width. It depends on the location of where those trees are, in like how fast they might grow or how slow they might grow. And it also depends on the weather conditions and the height of the helicopter and the type of nozzle that they're spraying with. So what we see here for fish-bearing streams, in Oregon we have a 60-foot no-cut. In Washington there's ranges for typical streams similar to Oregon coast is 100 to 150 feet, and in Idaho it's 100 feet. For perennial non-fish-bearing streams, in Oregon it's 0 feet no spray buffer. In Washington it's a 50 to 100 foot no spray, and in Idaho it's 100 feet no spray. For intermittent streams, For intermittent streams, when surface water is flowing at the time of application, they get treated exactly as perennial streams in Washington and Idaho with the same buffers. So what's really the big take-home message here is that all surface waters are protected in our neighboring states, but not, we don't feel like they are being protected here. Okay, buffers next to residential and agricultural lands. Oregon has a 0-foot no spray has no buffer for either. In Washington, there's a 200-foot buffer for residences, and in Idaho, it's a half a mile. And it's expanded buffers for certain types of formulations of 2,4-D. For agricultural lands, again, Oregon has no buffer. In Washington, it's 100 feet. And in Idaho, again, it's a half a mile. And up to 5 miles away for a high volatile ester formulation of 2,4-D, which, by the way, was also, that form of ester was recently reported as being sprayed in the Cedar Valley sprays area. Aerial spray restrictions are not protecting groundwaters. Oregon has no provision to protect groundwaters. Washington requires environmental analysis and bans certain restricted chemicals, including atrazine and hexazinone. Washington has mapped out all vulnerable groundwater areas throughout the whole state, so they are jump right on it if there's anything proposed. If a spray is proposed in the area, a SEPA analysis must be done. What that stands for is, if you're familiar with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, it's an environmental analysis. And in Washington, it's SEPA, State Environmental Policy Act, where they have their own environmental analysis that they do for certain impacts, potential impacts. Or aerial spray restrictions are not protecting Oregon's domestic water resources. Oregon requires only a 60-foot no spray buffer for domestic water sources. Washington requires an environmental analysis and a 200-foot no spray buffer. This is a photo of a sprayed clear cut in Oregon. This man is standing at his drinking water source at the base of the clear cut. It's hard to imagine runoff from this unit does not impact his drinking water. Washington, so these are additional regulations and agency responsibilities. The first one here, SEPA review for chemicals with high toxicity. Washington uses an online database to determine if the proposed pesticide has a high toxicity rating, and if it does, it triggers a SEPA review. The slide after this will go into that in a little bit more detail. Agency review period. Oregon Department of Forestry receives the spray notifications, but it's to our understanding that they cannot comment or review them. Washington has a 3-week comment period. Since the agencies in Oregon cannot make public comments, as far as neither can the Oregon public. And if the public, as Link mentioned, as the public wants access to spray notification, they must pay for them. Washington has an online database that allows the public to review all spray notifications without any fee. Their process also allows for public comments. Posting of the site. Residents in Oregon do not have to be told when the sprays are occurring. If the spray is even if the spray is adjacent to their property. In many cases they are told, but they don't have to be told. In Washington, spray units must be posted 5 days in advance and remain posted 15 days after spraying. The reason why our analysis only covers 3 years of data is because Oregon only requires landowners to keep spray records for 3 years. Washington requires records to be kept for 7 years. Keeping records longer than 3 years may be helpful for future research. So this is that online database that I mentioned. These are some of the forestry chemicals Washington has identified as having a toxicity rating of danger, and this is what triggers a SEPA analysis. From this list, there's 3 chemicals that we observed in the Triangle Lake data. Hardball, Velpar DF, and Westar were all sprayed in the Triangle Lake study area. The federal agencies that manage timberlands in western Oregon banned aerial spraying of pesticides in the 1980s. They concluded that spraying herbicide is not an environmentally sound practice and is not necessary for industrial harvesting of timber. Last December, 2 federal agencies, NOAA and EPA, requested public comments on their findings that Oregon Forest Practices Act falls short of protecting coastal streams. Following that announcement, the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife News Bulletin reported that EPA and NOAA had determined Oregon's logging practices for private lands were inadequate to protect small and medium-sized streams, and that there was a need to limit pesticide contamination. They went on to report that federal agencies repeatedly pointed to far more protective logging practices in Washington and California. In January, the Register-Guard, Eugene's newspaper, wrote a staff editorial that pointed out the inability for the Oregon public to access spray records. They also suggested that Oregon legislatures need to look towards Washington laws, state laws, as a minimum standard. So, in conclusion, our current Oregon regulations protecting natural resources and human health in rural communities. And has Oregon Forest Practices Act fallen behind current science, and does it use best management practices to date?
First question. Why is the chemical data not readily available to the public?
You mean the spray records? That I would have to ask Oregon Department of Forestry.
Well, as far as spray records not readily available,
Yeah.
a lot of that's proprietary information. They're pretty protectful of that. Just the same way, if you look at even private property rights, nobody has a right to walk up to you and say, hey, I want to know what you did on your property today, what you sprayed, what you're going to do. And some of these formulations, depending on what they spray, again, it is proprietary information. But again, if we believe that there is a violation, we have the authority to go to that and request that information. The best answer I can give you on that.
Thank you very much. Second question. We want to take written questions, which is so we can... Okay, why are records kept for only 3 years?
Unfortunately, I can't really answer these questions because I'm just saying what the regulations are. I mean, perhaps Lynn can answer it.
I don't know that I can give you an answer on that. That's just what the law requires at the time, is 3 years. I think it's ODS.
It's both sides, ODS and Oregon, the agriculture. That's the way the statute was written.
I can't read that.
Statute, sorry. It's statute law.
Who designed that road?
The Oregon legislature wrote those.
Okay, we want to remember to keep our clarifying questions on the material that has been presented. Okay? How did Washington get so much stronger protection?
I could speak a little to that. In the 1990s, Washington, and I mean, this is just from what I'm not representing Washington, obviously, but from what I can tell from talking to people who work there and from looking into things, Washington started this whole timber, fish, and wildlife program in the 1990s. And through that, they worked with private timber companies, tribal, state forests, U.S. forests were involved too. And they worked up a whole plan to, do you know more about this, Ernie? It was a whole program and looking at all things collectively. And then in the 1990s, I hope I'm answering this correctly. What I want to say, I'm going to skip now to, Link mentioned that the Oregon developed the Oregon Forest Practices Act in 1971, and at the time it was state-of-the-art. Washington really developed theirs in the 90s, and so by doing it in the 90s, they just became more state-of-the-art versus what was developed in 1971. Do you have anything to add, Lisa?
We did a whole study of their drinking water, riparian buffers, riparian areas, and based their regulations on firmly protecting all water resources. That is
Yeah.
Next, we have economic forces and trends shaping the timber industry Forest Management and Rural Communities in Western Oregon, Mr. Ernie Nemi.
Thank you very much. Let's see how this works. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I do this quite a lot in different communities, and I really appreciate the turnout here. This is a great group. To give you some background on who I am and why you might want to listen to what I have to say, sort of working backwards, I started paying attention to these issues about a year and a half ago when Governor Kitzhaber convened a panel of industry representatives, county representatives, and conservation group representatives to take a look at seeing if those groups could reach agreement on management of the O&C lands. Otherwise known as the BLM lands, sort of colloquially. I participated in that. I was not a representative or a member of the panel, but I participated as an economist helping out the conservation groups. Working back from that, I worked on forest management issues throughout the 80s and the early 1990s with the adoption of what's called the Northwest Forest Plan, which governs the management of federal lands in Western Oregon, Western Washington, and Northern California. An awful lot of these economic issues sort of went to the side, and we didn't pay an awful lot of attention to them until just recently. Before that, some of my first jobs included working for the Coos-Curry-Douglas Economic Development District. Some of you may remember that. I worked for Douglas Timber Operators in the Roseburg area, and worked for a very long time with a consulting firm in Eugene, and now my own consulting firm, looking at the intersection of natural resources and economic development in Oregon, in the U.S. West, in other parts of the United States, and overseas. My family took over homesteads just to the east of what is now Lincoln City, used to be called Taft at that time. My father and all of my uncles worked in the timber industry. In fact, one of my uncles claimed that he had one of the first 3 chainsaws ever to come into the state of Oregon. And it's a real beast. You didn't want to mess with that thing. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about some of these trends, some of these forces that are affecting the timber industry in Oregon and specifically in Western Oregon. I'm not here to draw any conclusions. I'm not here to make any recommendations. I'm merely here to present some information that I think might be useful to some of you. This slide starts out, and it shows what's happened to timber harvests. And we know that with the adoption of the Northwest Forest Plan, timber harvests on federal lands declined. And so overall timber harvests fell from about 8 billion board feet in the end of the 1980s down to about 4 billion board feet. And surprisingly, it's been fairly stable since about the mid-1990s. It did drop down in the recession, the Great Recession, beginning in 2008, but it's pretty much recovered since then. So we have this fairly stable level of timber harvest. Log prices, with the removal of federal timber from the market, log prices jumped up, but they've fallen back down now. So they are about roughly the same level as they were after you adjust for inflation. They're about the same level as they were, again, back in the mid-1980s. Log exports have increased recently. So if you look at this graph, there was quite an increase in log exports in the 1970s, 1980s. That dropped off. You saw about 400 million board feet throughout most of the 2000s, throughout the aughts, but then jumping in about 2009, jumping from about 400 million up to about almost 1 billion board feet of exports. So you have about the same level of harvest, but a larger share of those logs are going to exports in the last few years. This slide talks about timber jobs, what's happened here. And the title of this talks about the 1980s as a reference point. And that's important because prior to the mid-1980s, the timber industry had very powerful labor unions. But in the 1980s, with the Reagan administration that encouraged it, the labor unions were broke. And so since then, you've seen a fairly precipitous decline, an ongoing decline in jobs within the timber industry. Now, the blue line, or the light blue line, is one data series that the federal government used to maintain called the SIC, Standard Industrial Classification, that measured workers based on their industry. Beginning in the 1990s, since these data are compiled by the Department of Labor, they started to measure employment based on the type of occupation. And so you have a discontinuity in the data series. But the red line basically is looking at these new data series and trying to replicate as close as possible the old data series. And that's why you have the three different lines on this graph. So that currently in the state of Oregon, we have about 25,000 workers within the lumber and wood products industry, the main part of the timber industry. There's also a little box there on the upper right, because there's a belief here that northern spotted owls really is the cause of most of the job loss in this state. The Forest Service looked at this and basically concluded that in the 1990s, from when you had the northern spotted owl listed as a threatened species and restrictions placed on federal logging until the year 2000, so over that decade of the 1990s, Western Washington, Oregon, and California, Northern California, lost about 10,000 jobs within the timber industry, lumber and wood products industry, or about 30,000 jobs over that period for those three states. About 1/3 of that, or about 10,000 of those jobs, they could attribute to the changes in logging. The rest are attributable to changes in how the mills and the logging companies organized, how they worked, technology, and sort of labor-saving devices. So it's not really a spotted owl that is the source of this long-run decline in timber jobs. At the same time, you see that the wage premium paid within this industry has declined. And this really is attributable not to technology, not to anything else. This is attributable, I believe, to the busting of the unions. If you go back into the 1980s, workers in this industry earned on average a premium about 40% more than the average for all workers within the state. Over the last few years, that has declined so that now workers on average in this industry earn about the same level as the statewide average, or even in some years a little bit lower than the average for all workers in the state. Given these trends, stable levels of harvest, increases in exports, reductions in workers, and reductions in wages, what we see is that the timber industry is basically not a growth industry in this state, and it hasn't been a growth industry for a very long time. It's what economists call a mature industry. Well, there are other parts of the state's economy that are growth industries, and so as a percentage, what this graph shows is wood products as a percent of Oregon's GDP, or gross domestic product, which is a measure of overall economic activity. It's declined from about 12% in the 70s and 80s, so that we're now down to about 1%, maybe even less than 1%. That's not saying that the timber industry is bad or anything else. It's just saying that relative to other parts of the economy, it is not a growth sector here. Well, an awful lot of the attention right now focuses on O&C lands, so I want to talk about them a little bit here. The O&C lands are sometimes called the checkerboard lands. O&C stands for the O&C Railroad. Congress awarded the O&C Railroad Company every other section of timberland up and down western Oregon, with the expectation that it would sell the land in small parcels to farmers to populate the area. Those farmers would produce products that would become shipped on the railroad, and this would be an opening up of western Oregon to civilization and commercial activity. Early in the 1920s, or around the 1920s, actually before the 1920s, what we found was that company was committing an awful lot of corruption. At one time, I've understood that there are 1,000 people who were indicted in Portland for the corruption, and eventually Congress took the remaining lands that the company hadn't already sold or disposed of, took them back, and gave them basically to be managed by the Department of Interior, by the Bureau of Land Management. They're called the O&C lands. They're about 2.5 million acres. This is about 1/10 of the total of West Side federal lands in western Oregon, Western Washington and Northern California. There are two major proposals to increase logging on these lands, one sponsored by Representative DeFazio, the other by Senator Wyden. The main focus of these proposals is to increase county revenue because the counties receive a share of the proceeds that BLM receives when it sells timber. The counties, by statute, receive 75% of that money, but they give 25% of that back. So the counties would receive about 1/2 of the money that BLM receives from selling timber. Also to create jobs. There's a great expectation that the DeFazio bill will not pass. The House passed the DeFazio bill as part of a larger bill sponsored by Representative Hastings from Eastern Washington. But it's sitting in the Senate right now, and Senator Wyden will do whatever he's going to do. And so you look at Senator Wyden's bill would provide about $40 million per year to the counties. There's some uncertainty there because Senator Wyden hasn't really fleshed out what his bill is going to look like, and create about 1,600 jobs. Well, there are options for dealing with taxes, and this is information that was presented to the ONC panel, the governor's ONC panel, about a year ago. Until 1993, Washington, Oregon, and California each had a timber harvest tax, and they're about the same. There are some differences, but they're about the same. But in 1993, the industry in Oregon persuaded the legislature to eliminate the timber harvest tax in Oregon. Well, you look at the purple line, that's Oregon. And there is a small timber harvest tax there. It's about $10 million each year. But really what that is that money goes back to the industry. It goes from the left pocket to the right pocket. Some of that money, for example, pays for the Oregon Department of Forestry to implement the Oregon Forest Practices Act. Some of it goes for the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, which is a public relations arm of the industry. Some of it goes for research and to fight fires. The green line is really the most interesting here. That's what happens in Washington. In Washington, it shows what is the total harvest tax that is paid each year in Washington. So on the left-hand side, in 1985, you show it was up to $100 million. That's the longest line that is there, the tallest line that's there. The dotted line, however, shows the share of that is designated by statute to go to counties. And if you trace that dotted line across, and what this graph shows is what the counties in Western Oregon, the so-called ONC counties, what they would have received if they had Washington's timber harvest tax. The red line is what the counties would have received if they had California's timber harvest tax. And by the way, last year, California increased their timber harvest tax, so it's very similar in height now to Washington, or will be going forward. The dotted line shows the percentage or the amount of money that would be designated, stipulated that it would go to counties, and it's about $40 million. So in effect, what Senator Wyden's bill is proposing is let's cut trees in order to replace the timber harvest tax that we had in this state until about 1993. It's one way to think about that. Another revenue option that we have is state tax reform. An awful lot that's talked about that. One of the things that stimulates this discussion, and there's expectation that Governor Kitzhaber is going to come up with a major proposal for the next legislature, is differences in property tax rates. The amount of money that you pay per $1,000 of real market value. That's what RMV says. And what we see is that the statewide average was $12.34 per $1,000 of real market value. Curry County is over here at $7.43, or between 1/2 and 2/3 of the statewide average. So there are some revenue options that are out there. And one of the reasons that I bring this up is that I'm not arguing for one or another of these. What I'm saying is that the debate that will take place, the debate that is taking place, brings these other options onto the table. And so these are some of the forces, these are some of the trends that are at play as we were talking about what to do with timber harvest in this state. We also have other options for generating revenues and jobs. And one of those that's talked about an awful lot is people move to live in places where they like to live, where there's a high quality of life. And Curry County certainly is one of those places. The purple places are where people move to. The orange places are where people move from. There's no surprise that there's an awful lot of orange in Nebraska and that there's an awful lot of purple in Western Oregon. When you start messing with the quality of life and the amenities that people get from the clean water, from hunting opportunities, from fishing opportunities and the like, you mess around with this mechanism of economic growth. This is important for many reasons. One of them is just the outdoor recreation industry. What this shows is that the timber industry now has about 25, maybe 30,000 workers. The outdoor recreation industry has about 140,000 workers in this state. Oregon as a whole has 1.7 million workers. The new jobs that we're talking about is maybe 1,600 from the Wyden bill in the timber industry. The Oregon outdoor recreation industry has been generating about 7,000 jobs per year each year, even through the Great Recession of the past few years. There's a new concern here, and that's forest carbon. Forest carbon is something that we didn't talk about at all when we developed the Northwest Forest Plan, but it gets an awful lot of attention right now. This graph shows the carbon per acre for national forests. And it's for national forests, but you can look at private land or state land in the same region and you get pretty much the same picture. And what you see is the carbon per acre, and Link said it earlier, this is one of the best places to grow trees in the world. And the carbon per acre that you find here is higher than almost any other place in the world. There is reportedly a very small place in Australia where it's higher, but it's nowhere near as extensive as what you find here. This is the blue ribbon place. If you want to look at ability to hold carbon, pull it out of the atmosphere, and address some of the concerns about global climate change. When you look at all of this, and you look at research that was completed at Oregon State University in 2012, they compared two alternatives. One is you continue to manage the federal lands as we are managed right now. Basically, you're conserving them, letting them grow. When you let them grow, they become what's called a carbon sink. They pull carbon out of the air, and they hold on to that carbon. If you manage those lands, however, for industrial timber production, they would become a source of carbon back to the atmosphere. If you look at the difference between those two, it's about 4 tons of carbon dioxide per acre per year, going from a sink to a source. If you then apply what is the value of that carbon, and economists talk about the value in terms of what is the damage that carbon dioxide generates around the world when it goes up into the atmosphere. And this compares two alternatives. The dark gray shows the value of the lost carbon using the official federal numbers, estimates of the value of carbon, value of carbon dioxide, or the social cost of carbon is a way to think about that. And it's basically looking at somewhere between $44 to $83 a ton over the next couple of decades. The light gray shows, well, it reflects research that says the federal numbers are really very, very conservative, extremely conservative, in fact, and it's pretty easy to get up to an estimate of about $250 per ton. It's actually easier to get up to about $1,000 per ton because none of this, for example, takes into account ocean acidification and the effects of that. If you look at this, you're seeing that the carbon dioxide from managing federal lands in Western Oregon to produce timber would generate a carbon cost of about $20,000 per acre, maybe even $80,000 per acre, maybe more than that. In contrast, the value of the timber is about $5,000 per acre. That comes from the DeFazio bill that was going to privatize land. And so the timber industry had to estimate how much were they going to pay. And they basically estimated that they would pay about $5,000 per acre for those public lands. So we see that timber production on these lands is about $5,000 per acre. The carbon value is a cost of about $20,000 to maybe $80,000 per acre. Then you have the water and habitat, other things. That's the green stuff on the right. And that's why you see, from an economist perspective, that's why you see so much tension over proposals to log on federal lands. I'm not getting into hugging trees or owls or feathers or fish scales or whatnot. This is strictly hard-nosed number values. So with that, we'll close. If you have any questions, you certainly can contact me at either of these sources right here.
Okay, we'll get started while we're waiting here. First question, please elaborate on the effects of log exports on the economic health of rural timber-dependent communities.
Well, the effect on rural communities is basically that you have logs that otherwise let's assume that the tree would have been cut. And with the left hand, it goes to the local mill, and it supports jobs associated with the milling and the production of and use of, the sale of manufactured forest products. With the right hand, it doesn't go that way. It goes to the port and is exported overseas. You have a smaller number of jobs. I haven't seen a recent estimate of what that difference is, but you just have fewer jobs being generated because you aren't processing that material.
What is the property tax on private forest land compared to residential?
It varies from place to place. I've heard somebody recently say that, let me see if I can get this right. What Weyerhaeuser pays on its land as a property tax is about 1/60th of what this person who had looked at these numbers pays per $1,000 on his home. So property taxes on private timberland in this state are very, very low. I mean, they don't even show up on the graph. They're so small.
Okay, I think it says, do you think it is possible to protect water from pesticides?
Is it possible? Sure. It's certainly possible, but that question doesn't really get into the really interesting questions of how do you do it, and how do we get from here to there?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.